Hello, this is Visitations Conversations. The purpose of this program is to provide inspiration to people aspiring to go deeper into the world of comics and entertainment. Please check out the channel for interviews that range from comic creators, podcasters, cosplayers, and filmmakers. My name is Scott Larson, and I am the creator of the independent comic book series Visitations. Visitations is the history of Chicago as seen through the eyes of the residents of the city's oldest cemetery. It's part history, part adventure, and part horror story all rolled into one, kind of like the Untouchables meet Indiana Jones in a graveyard. If you're interested in reading a free digital copy of the book, you can email me at visitationscomicbook, all one word, at gmail.com or click the link below. Today, I'm really excited because one of the people who I believe is the best comic book writer who ever existed is going to be talking to us. J.M. Dematteis has written everything from the Justice League, which is this, to Spider-Man. He is currently the writer of the Spider-Man Ben Reilly book and has a couple other things he's going to talk to us about. So if you're able to log yourself in, we are all set for you.
Here we are.
There you are. Hi, how are you?
Good. How you doing?
Good. How's the weather in New York?
Absolutely beautiful. It's going to be about 80 degrees. There's no humidity, blue skies. It's great. Perfect weather.
I'm in Chicago. We had nice 70-degree weather today, which means today is probably about 38. That's how we do things. So you've got a new book out, which is Ben Reilly Spider-Man, which is the latest issue, and the next issue is going to be coming out.
I think the fifth issue comes out next week. Yeah.
And you've been doing a whole round of interviews, and I've listened to all of them. So I've got a bunch of questions.
So you must be bored to tears.
No, but I, the thing is, it's like some of them gave me ideas for questions, and then some of them I was like, no, you've already asked my question. Now I'm going to have to come up with something else. So I've got a number of things I'm going to ask you about your writing and your writing process and some of the projects that you've worked on. The first thing I ever read from you was the Iceman Miniseries from 1984. And that was a story where in the middle of it, you pulled it back to the future and you killed off Bobby Drake's parents during World War II.
Right.
And I remember when I saw Back to the Future, I'm like, they stole that guy's idea.
Yeah, I don't think they did. I really don't think they did.
Maybe.
Someone else mentioned that to me once, and I was like, I really don't think so. Doing this as long as I've been doing it, ideas are always floating around the ethers,
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how many times I have this brilliant original idea that no one has ever had before. And 2 days later, I read an article about this movie that's in development with the same exact idea. It's just the way it works. And sometimes it's very frustrating, but that is the way of the world. And people always assume they stole my idea. Sometimes people do, but in general, I think it's just similar ideas popping.
Well, the collective unconsciousness.
Yes, exactly.
Called it.
Yeah.
So I've got all kinds of weird questions for you. But before I go into those, I'm going to ask you a fairly light question. Do you remember what the first comic book you ever read was?
I really don't, because I don't remember comic books not being in my life.
Mm-hmm.
I was probably reading newspaper comic strips first, because when I was a kid, that was a big deal. The Daily News Sunday comics in New York was like, they were big, and it was like page after page after page. And that's probably where I fell in love with that combination of words and pictures. And comics were just around when I was a kid. You didn't go to a specialty store. They were being sold everywhere. And just about every kid I knew read comics, so they were always there. But one of my primal memories is, I think it was a cousin of mine who gave me what seemed like 1,000 comics. It was probably 20 comics, but I was really young, and I remember laying them all out on the floor. There were some old Marvels, and there were a lot of DC, and I've just, I say when I do my writing workshops that we talk about this, why comics? And I think for some of us, there's just a special little chemical in our brains that drops when we see that connection, coming together of words and pictures. There's something about those two elements together, and this magical chemical drops in our brain, and we are addicted for life, and there's nothing we can do about it. Because other people, look at that and it's like, oh, some people are like, I don't even know where to look. Where do the balloons go? I don't understand. That just does, it has no impact. And then there's this whole other group of us. It's like, it's just this instant understanding and this instant love, and we are addicted forever.
So when you decided you're going to become a writer, and I'm curious as to how that idea came. Were you always planning to do comics, and were you thinking? There's a second part to that question, though. Were you thinking you were going to do comics in the way things were done when you were growing up, or were you thinking you were going to bring all this extra stuff in as you actually have this psychological?
I don't think anyone sets out. I wasn't thinking that far ahead. You discover that as you go along. I was always a creative kid. Most of my childhood was spent drawing. Really, my art was my first love. I was always drawing. I was like the artist kid in the class always. And then, like in the fifth grade, when I was in the fifth grade was when the Beatles were on the Ed Sullivan Show, and all of a sudden rock and roll became my life. And I took guitar lessons. I played in bands. And while I was doing that, I was still drawing. And I always had an affinity for writing also. So I was just creative. I liked creative things. And I think probably, my first thoughts were either I'm going to be an artist or a rock and roll star. Two very, very practical goals. Sure. Professional artist or a rock and roll star. And what I was supposed to go to art school. I was accepted to the School of Visual Arts in New York City. I was a working class kid from Brooklyn. My parents didn't have the money. I didn't even know that you could get financial aid, so I didn't even think to apply. My parents said, we can't afford that. And that was the end of that, And then in college, I started to focus more on my writing than on my art. And it just sort of naturally evolved. And I was, playing music, and then I started doing rock and roll journalism. But I always had this love of comics and wanted to get into comics. And probably when I was about 18, I had no idea what a comic book script looked like. And I wrote a sample script and sent it to Marvel, and got back a fairly rude letter. You learn over the years that even if something is terrible, find something to encourage in the work, but maybe this person was having a bad day. He was an assistant editor at the time. It's a name you would know, so I will not mention the name. But the thing is, when you have a passion for something, rejection ultimately doesn't matter. I always say to my students, go crawl under your desk, bang your head against the wall, shake your fist, curse God, and then get out from under your desk and sit down and start writing again, or drawing, or dancing, or singing, or whatever it is, So I remember the year after that, DC launched an apprenticeship program where they were taking people. You would send in writing samples. They picked a small group of people that they were training. I think one of the people that got in was David Michelinie, and I very stupidly said, I know what I'll write. I'll write a Justice League script. So to this day, writing team books is one of the hardest things you can do in comics. It's really, really difficult to find all them. So for me at 19, trying to write a team book was absurd. I don't, still have the scripts. I don't even remember what it was about. But the nice thing was that someone at DC, unlike the guy at Marvel the year before, took the time to write me back with criticism, with helpful comments, and just to have someone reach out and respond was a phenomenal thing. It was just a phenomenal thing. So, I was still going along and playing in bands, and I was also writing short stories and sending them out and getting tons of rejections. Same thing. If you got a positive rejection, if they said, wow, you're really talented, but we can't use this story, that was almost as good as them buying it. A little bit of praise goes a long way. A little bit of encouragement goes a long way. So finally, I'm condensing all this stuff. At one point, Oh, two things happened. One was I knew a guy from Brooklyn College who was working in the production department at Marvel, and he had sold some things to Crazy Magazine. If you remember Crazy, it was Mad. It was Marvel's magazine
Right.
knockoff, and it was not my forte at all. But he said, "Come on, send him some stuff." So I sent in some stuff, and a man named Paul Lakin, who was the editor of Crazy, bought one of the things. To this day, I don't know why he bought it, but he did, and I got a check with Spider-Man's name on it. Was so cool. Not Spider-Man's name, Spider-Man's face was on it. Spider-Man didn't sign the check, which would have been even cooler, right? If Spider-Man signed the check. And I was hoping that maybe having an in with Crazy Magazine would get me in with the comics, but it never did. I couldn't make any headway on the comic side of Marvel. So I just continued doing, and what I always say to people, you knock your head against the wall, but eventually that wall is going to crack. You'll get through somewhere. So I was just always sending stuff out, and I wrote up some samples. I sent them to DC. I got a letter back saying Paul Levitz, who I probably had never even heard of at the time, was looking for stories for the anthology books. They had, House of Mystery, Weird War Tales, House of Secrets. I had never read those comics. I had no idea they existed. I ran out, I bought a bunch of them, read them, wrote up some ideas, sent them off to Paul, and I still have the letter that Paul sent me where he tore my stories apart, criticized my typing, justifiably, and at the end said, please feel free to submit again. So, when you're hungry, okay, you don't see the criticism. All you see in big letters at the bottom is please feel free to submit again, which I did several times. And finally, since I lived in New York, I said, hey, could I come up to the office and pitch you some ideas there? Which he said, sure, come on up. I mean, Paul was amazing that he took the time with someone who was basically nobody to read the material, to react to the material, to invite me to come up, and I pitched him some ideas, and he bought one of them. And, so for like 6 months, I was selling stories to all those anthology comics, and then came the famous, or should I say infamous, DC implosion. DC had expanded their line, and within like a couple of months, they cut, I don't know what it was, 60% of the line. And the first people to get thrown out the door were the most recent people in the door. That was me. There was no work. And it took about almost another year before I started getting a work from DC again. And in the meantime, I was doing journalism and still trying to get in the door at Marvel. Eventually got some samples to Jim Shooter, who read them and liked them. So I made my connection there. And then DC started working with me again. I started getting regular work, and one thing leads to another. And here I am all these years later, And that has opened the door for me into TV, into film, into books, into all these other worlds, So I think going back to your original question, I didn't see myself as a comic book writer. I always saw myself as a writer. I always saw myself as a creative person who wanted to be creative in whatever venue you could find to express that creativity. Yeah.
So I've got a couple a reaction to that, and I'm curious. So you went to you got an acceptance letter, but you didn't attend the School of Visual Arts,
right?
When you're plotting stuff out, you had mentioned in an interview that you just like stare off into space, and the ideas come to you, and creative people know what that means. We all go through something like that. But I'm curious, when you start to, because your work is so visual, even though it's in writing, and it doesn't matter who the artist is. And I was just looking at, as a matter of fact, I was looking at, I bound the Clone Saga stuff before they actually did it themselves. But I like mine better because I was able to put things in that they didn't bother. But I was looking at the stuff that Luke Ross did when you came back to the books. Right. And I was looking at, because of some of the writing you did, but I couldn't help but notice that some of these camera angles are the same kind of camera angles that Mark Bagley used and that Sal Buscema had used. And I'm curious, do you actually, when you plot stuff out, do you draw it out to a certain degree? Do you do like?
No, I don't draw it, but I do see it in my head very clearly, and I think very visually. And there are certain visual things that I like, and as you said, you'll see in my work that I will use. but just the art absolutely matters. Every artist, comics is a visual medium, and without the right artist, and I've seen the wrong artist pull my story down. I've seen the right artist lift my story up. Every element, in fact, in a comic, I've seen letterers pull my story down and lift my story up, because that's the communication of my story is through the lettering. We take that story in through those words, and the way that they are actually lettered on the page changes your perception of the story. It's an interesting thing. So yeah, Craven's Last Hunt with someone other than Mike Zeck maybe wouldn't be talking about it. At the same time, yeah, like when I worked with Sal, the plots were very, very tight. So when you see those pages where it's like a 9 or a 12 panel grid, and it's a close up, close up, close up, close up, and there's maybe a little shift in an expression, close up, and another shift. That's all there in the plot.
Okay.
But if anyone other than Sal had drawn that, it could have gone completely off the rails. Sal is a masterful storyteller. You can explain and explain and explain to an artist in your plot or your full script, which I like to work both ways. But if they don't understand the art of visual storytelling, if they can't communicate emotions, if they can't communicate the flow of action from panel to panel, I can write till I'm blue in the face and that story's going to die. You need the right artist, or it's not going to work. I've been lucky in that I've worked with a lot of great artists. When you mentioned Bagley, when I went from Sal to Bagley said, can these plots not be as tight? He didn't like that I was like laying out every panel. So I gave him a little more room to breathe. And when it was needed and specific, yeah, I would go in for that. So a lot of times it depends on your artist's preference. But these days I find, if I'm working in a plot thing, I always say to the artist, feel free to disregard this if you want. I write it this way because this is how I see the story. So I'm writing, people think when they hear plot first, they hear these stories about Stan Lee in the 60s, where you give somebody one line and they go off and they draw a 20-page story. It ain't like that. It's page by page, it's panel by panel, it's camera angles, it's the whole thing. But I don't want the artist to be restricted by that, especially if you're working with an artist who knows their stuff. They're going to find some way in there that might be better than what you're laying out. And other times you might say, this sequence, I really want you to do it this way because this is the way I see it. And I think it'll be the most impactful, but you have to be open to what your artist brings to the table. So, you can't separate the writing and art in comics. You just can't. They are so dependent on each other. And that includes the color and the lettering, every piece of it.
When an artist comes to you, or let's say they get a plot from you, and it's like super tight, and they've decided to do something else. Do they get your permission, or do they just go and do that? And I have a second part to that question too.
Yeah, there have been times when you've seen artists disregard what's in the plot, and it depends. If you work certain artists, not so much disregarding, but the visual interpretation will be very different. They're still communicating all your plot points, but they're communicating it visually in a different way. And so when I say I've worked with Keith Giffen, who's, Keith is like Kirby. So like, there's an idea, and I'll be throwing stuff in. I didn't expect that, but it all still works within the context of my story when I've worked with Keith, not as a co-writer, but as an artist. Liam Sharp, when we worked together on Man Thing, would come up with surprising visual interpretations and little touches, but he always respected the story. The flip side of that, and especially when you're working plot first, are artists that don't really know what they're doing or still have something to learn. And I always go back to this one thing, and I don't even remember who the artist was, honestly, but it was back in the 90s, and I wrote the plot for this story. And it was a time when the image thing was becoming very popular, and, these poses, everybody posing, and it was a bunch of characters, a big fight going on, the team of characters and a villain. And in the middle of this fight, instead of what was in the plot, the artist drew a full page of the villain just standing there because he probably thought he could resell that page. And what do you do? Well, when you're working plot first, what you do is you have to find ways to write around it. Here comes a bunch of balloons from off panel explaining the things that he didn't draw. If you really know how it works, you can do so much when you're dialoguing. That's why people that dismiss Stan and say, well, Kirby laid out the story, he came up with all these ideas. What did Stan do? He just put some dialogue in. No, there's so much you can do in the dialogue stage of the story to reshape it and change it. Even when I'm working from my own plot, I plot a story, I get the art back. When I get to the dialogue stage, it's almost like I'm another writer collaborating with myself because I can play with it. Oh, that thing that I wanted to say on page 3, it's not going to really work here. I'll do it on page 6. Well, maybe I don't need it at all, you know?
Mhm.
I would rather overstuff the plots and have things that I can throw out than underwrite the plots. You know, because I also, you know, in a plot and in a script too, you want the artist not to just know what the visuals are, but you want them to know what these characters are thinking and feeling. So I may describe the art on the page and then have parentheticals underneath that where I'm explaining what they're going through emotionally and psychologically and what the theme of the story is, whatever it may be. You want your artist to have as much information as possible.
You know, I had read way back in the 90s when you and Keith Giffen were working on Justice League, and you would put things, because the way I understand it was he was doing the plots and you were doing the scripts on that.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And you would put things in the scripts that he wasn't expecting, and then he would create stories just from like little lines that you threw in.
Yeah, it would work, you know, it worked both ways. Like, you know, Keith could call me up and tell me what's in the next plot. And by the time he drew the plot, it was completely different. You know, even when we were working on projects where we were like, you know, bouncing the plot around together, the beauty of our collaboration was that nobody gave a damn in the best possible way. Keith would go off and change things, and then I'd get it. And when I'm dialoguing, if I want to, you know, add, you could, like I said, you could rewrite the story. You can add entire character interactions that aren't in the plot. And then Keith would see that and build on that. And then I'd see the way he spin things around and the things that he'd add, and I'd add, you know, so it was like a game of tennis. You know, other people, I've had instances where I've dialogued from other people's plots and they did not want me changing things. They didn't like that. With Keith, I always say there was no creative ego on either side. We both, you know, we both just enjoyed the back and forth. You know, it was just fun. And that's why we kept working together for so many years after that.
So I'm curious about something. When you're doing a story structure and you're handed a character, you know, you're not working on your own stuff, but you're handed a character. And the one I'm going to use as an example is Hal Jordan when he became the Spectre.
Mm-hmm.
And you had that series that ran for a couple of years, I believe.
Yeah, I think it ran almost like maybe 2.5, 3 years. Yeah.
When you're working on a character like that, obviously you're getting inside the character's head, and especially in that series,
Yes.
because that was the whole redemption thing, and that, you know, he was followed along by Ab and Sur, and they were like having a conversation and stuff. Would you go back and reread the character basically as much as you possibly could? With Hal Jordan, that was someone who had been around for like 30 years at that point. And when you do you try to get in his head in the earlier stuff that you didn't write?
That's interesting. You know, when I first started in the business, anytime I'd get a new gig,
Mhm.
I would have to go out and buy like, you know, 100 back issues and read every single one. It was a great excuse, you know, being a comic book nerd, to just buy a bunch more comics, you know? And as time went by, I would read what was necessary. I mean, you're doing Green Lantern, you know, first of all, I grew up loving and knowing Green Lantern. I was aware enough to know Hal Jordan, and they explained what the situation was and how he became the Spectre. And you come to your own understanding of that character. Obviously, you have to do some research. You know, the fun of it in what I do for a living is, you know, same thing with the animated stuff. They'll call me up and say, "You want to write an animated movie with such and such a character?" Well, I don't really know that character. Well, they send me a bunch of stuff. And so my work day is reading comics. You know, It's great. It's a great thing. It's a great thing. And I can say, I'm working right now. Excuse me, let me read this comic book. Yeah. But, you know, now I don't feel a need to read everything. I just want to get a sense of the character. And also in the world of Wikipedia, you can read the entire character's history without having to read every single story that they were ever in. And you know, at this point in time, reading every single story, you want to know what's important. And like, you know, the company will send you stuff, you know, now everything's digital. So you'll get a file and it's filled with comics that you can and look through and check and see what's going on. And, but in terms of getting into their head, like going back and thinking about who they were, no, you kind of take the entirety of the character in, and you want to be aware of that history because that history impacts them psychologically and emotionally. But I don't have to know every little beat. And then you also hope that your editor knows what they're talking about. So that if you make a misstep, you go, no, can say, no, you can't do that because, you know, 30 years ago, he said this or did this, and this contradicts that. You want to get to the, you want to get to the heart and soul of the character. The details, after a certain point, details aren't important. The essence is what's important. I've seen it's the same thing when I've done adaptations in these animated movies of pre-existing comic book stories. You don't have to hit every detail of that story, and you can't when you're doing an adaptation. What you want to do is capture the essence of that story, use that as your foundation, and build out from there, and bring something of yourself to that story.
One of the things that I noticed with the first issue of Ben Reilly, the new one, is, and I review comics and I like comics and I buy them for myself and the whole thing, and I'm reading old comics and new comics. I picked that book up and I started reading it and I felt like I had sunk into the story. And that was an experience I hadn't had before. And it's interesting because, there are different writers from who used to do things in the past who've come back and they've done new stuff. And it's like, oh, hey, this is like hanging out with an old friend. With your stuff, it literally like pulled me down. And so I wanted to mention a couple of themes to you that tend to pop up in your books. And I'm curious as to what your reaction is, or what that means to you, or any kind of comment you have about these things. So the first theme, and this goes to probably the earliest stuff I read from you, is death. And the Craven's Last Hunt book, I know you answer a lot of questions about that.
I do.
But when I was 17 years old and I read that first issue, it was about a year after my mom had died. And Peter Parker is like, he's in his room and he's like, Joe Face had died, or whoever the guy's name was.
Right, that was Joe Face. You're right.
Okay. And I'm gonna die someday, and Mary Jane's gonna die someday, and Aunt May's gonna die. And I was reading that, I'm like, God, my cat's gonna die someday. And it was like one of those things where, as a 17-year-old kid, if your mind is working in a certain way, that's gonna hit you like that. And what I've noticed is that is a theme that does reach out into a lot more of your stuff. And I'm curious, I don't have a real question where I'm like, well, what do you think of this? Or what happens when we die, or anything like that. But I'm curious as to how that speaks to you. Where does that come from?
I think it's the theme in everyone's life, isn't it? It's,
the people who want to face it.
Yeah. I think everyone does to some degree or other. And I wrote about this in Brooklyn Dreams and in Moonshadow. When I was about 3-4 years old, I still, I don't know whether I remember it or I remember the story of, sometimes memories, if you're remembering the memory or remembering the story that you've told so many times. But I was about 4 years old, and I do remember this. I was in the bathtub, and all of a sudden, I don't know what, how, or why, I became aware of death and mortality. It just like descended on me. And, I think most 4-year-olds, it probably doesn't, but it did. And I remember really, really just freaking out and crying, and my parents, trying to comfort me. My father saying, yes, we're all going to die, but not for a very long time. Well, both of my parents are gone for a long time now. So time is like that. And I think if you're human and you're alive, you can't not think about that. You can. And then you think about, what does that mean? That leads to the next question. Well, why are we here? And what is the meaning of this? Which are other themes that run through all my work, where does that awareness come from in a 4-year-old? I don't know. Does it come from something I saw or heard, or did it come from another incarnation? I don't know, but it was very, very powerful. But that leads to very important and really interesting questions about, if we're not, some people think of that, you said you were 17, as if these questions are only important when you're like an adolescent or a young adult. But these are the primal questions of being alive on the planet, and people like to distract themselves from them. But the primal questions are, why am I here? What is the purpose of this existence? Is there anything more, And these are the things, whether it's, cosmically, philosophically, spiritually, or psychologically and emotionally, that have always fascinated me, that have always driven my life, personally, and then it all gets reflected in your work. And you talk about these themes, in the beginning, certainly I didn't sit down and say, here's my theme, I'm going to,
Sure.
then, you look back after 6 months or a year and you go, oh, wow, there's that theme. There's a lot of people dealing with their fathers. Oh, there's a lot of family themes. Oh, there's death. Oh, there's a search for meaning, then you realize that all writers have their themes. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how, quote, escapist your entertainment is. Everybody's wrestling with their own personal demons and angels, and they're all reflected in their stories.
Do you see your stories as a part of you?
Yeah. I mean, in some way, every character is an aspect of my psyche, and the paradox of it is, so every character is an aspect of my psyche, but once you create them, they take on a life of their own. So they're me and they're not me. I almost see it as a very similar to what I believe that all of this is, take this as a story if you don't believe in God, but I in a way, I see God as a writer. You know what I mean? God is creating this universe. God is taking parts of his own consciousness, and he's creating you, and he's creating me, and he's creating this one and that one. He's creating the world, but it's all made from the same stuff. It's all God in disguise. Puts a little mask on. It looks like me, a little mask, and then the fun is he makes all these little pieces forget that they're actually just God. It's like your hand going, I'm an individual finger. And then one day you wake up and go, oh my God, I'm a hand, and so we all think we're individual fingers when in truth we are God and we are the hand. Clumsy metaphor, but I think you know what I mean.
Sure.
And I think it's the same thing with our stories. I create these stories out of my own psyche and all these characters. People always ask about Craven's Last Hunt. And I look at what I was going through in my life then, and Craven, Peter, Vermin, all of them in some way were representations of something I was going through, something in my own psyche. And then at the same time, they're not me. They are individual characters with lives of their own. So you can't take these things literally autobiographically.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Like you can't match it up necessarily to events in my life in a direct way because, well, I don't spin webs and I'm not a cannibal man rat and I'm not a hunter in leopard skin pants, But the psychological and emotional truth of those characters comes from me, but then they become themselves too. And that's the paradox, just as, we are literally God and yet we are individuals at the same time. And there's the paradox.
I had a couple more themes
that was a light answer, huh?
Well, it wasn't a light question. What about duality?
What about it?
Because that pops up quite a bit in your work as well.
Yeah, that's, the same thing when we're talking about death. At a certain point when I was a teenager, if there was anything that drove me mad, it was that the duality. It was the push and pull of the opposites inside ourselves and in the world, and we are, everybody, and writers deal with this, I think, and artists in general, anybody in the creative arts deals with this probably more than the average person does or wants to, because as a writer, how do you write a crazed supervillain? Because you have a crazed supervillain somewhere in your own soul and psyche. You may not act on that, but writers are aware. I'm aware of every little maggot under every rock in my psyche. And I'm also aware of every angel in my psyche, so, and we are all that. We are all that. I always go back to the Dostoevsky quote from, I think it's from the Brothers Karamazov, good and evil are so monstrously mixed up in man, and the duality drove me crazy until I found the door open to something that transcended the push and pull of duality. And it used to be like this for me. And now I see duality more like this. These two things can actually coexist. They don't have to fight each other, So yeah, it's always been something. And I remember being 17 and reading Dostoevsky for the first time and going, oh my God, yes, this is exactly right. This is how I feel, So yes, duality, big theme. Because it's a big theme of being alive. It's our lives. And if you're honest with yourself, we're full of all these opposites. We just are. That's the business of being human. You can be the kindest, sweetest, most loving. You could be Mother Teresa. And I'm sure she had a lot of stuff going on in her head that she had to wrestle with, our worst impulses and our best impulses. And it isn't so much that we contain terrible impulses. It's how do we act in our lives? I can have a terrible thought about somebody and then turn around and be kind to them because I choose to do that, or it could be a bad day and I could be a miserable son of a bitch to them. That's our choice. but we all contain all that stuff. And as I said, I think as writers, we have to get in touch with all that stuff, because how else do you write this stuff? How do you write a villain? And that also allows you to have compassion for the villain. You want to write a good villain, even as you're opposing what he stands for, have compassion, understand what made him what he was or she was, and how they got there. That will make a more interesting three-dimensional villain.
Interesting. So one of the things that I found really interesting about your work is, and you've talked a lot about, in the 90s when you were working on Spider-Man, you were either working on part 4 of a 4-part story or something like that. But the other thing that happened was you were writing the Spectacular book and someone else was writing Amazing Spider-Man. And there were some things that and it was David Michelinie, who is, he's one of my cat friends. His cat looks like my cat. And so we go back and forth on Facebook about it.
He's a very nice guy and a wonderful writer. Yeah.
Really nice guy. Very, very, very nice guy. And, but one of the things that I found was he was introducing some stuff in his work that you were picking up the ball in your work and running with. And one of them was Mary Jane smoking, which he had introduced into that. And he did it for a reason that made complete and utter sense. But it felt a little bit more real when you were dealing with it, or Peter's parents. And the thing that was really interesting about that was before Peter's parents were brought back, about a year before was when you did that Child Within story, where he was dealing with them being gone. And then all of a sudden they're like back in his face. And
right. Peter's parents, I'm trying to remember, Peter's parents, that might have been when was that during Spectacular?
Yeah.
It did, but I don't think it came up much in Spectacular. I really don't. Honestly, I tried to avoid it as much as I could. I wasn't a big, and I know David wasn't a fan of that,
right,
that storyline either. He's very clear about that. And then I know during the Clone Saga, I think they were a little more present.
They were gone.
They were gone?
Yes.
Maybe it was Maximum Carnage. I'm thinking they were around for Maximum Carnage. That's what it was. Yeah. Because when I wrote Spectacular, Danny Fingeroth used to call it the Dematteis verse, because he let me go off in my little corner. And yes, there are certain things, if I'm dealing with Mary Jane and she has a smoking issue, then we're going to deal with the smoking. The parents are around, maybe you have to acknowledge that they exist, but that wasn't what I was interested in. I was interested in Peter and Harry and that story that ran through the 2 years, and the other characters that I was bringing in. So you don't want to ignore what the other person is doing, but you also don't want to be locked into it, because you want David to be able to tell his stories the way he wants to tell them, and me to tell my stories, and whoever's writing the third book to tell their stories. And if you do it right, everybody has a unique and distinctive voice. As we're talking about, everybody has different themes that obsess them. So each book should have a distinctive personality. And you mentioned you're not wanting to write chapter 4. That's one of the problems when you have interlocking books. You have 4 different voices. And so we would all get together, and it was great fun. I loved those days during the Clone Saga when we would all get together, the writers, the editors, and on special occasions, we'd even bring in all the artists. We'd have a big meeting. We'd discuss the stories. We would have so much fun because I loved those guys. They were great guys. We all respected each other. And then you go home and you write your chapter. And sometimes I'd see one of the other guys' chapters, and well, that wasn't the way I saw it when we discussed it, because I'm not him. He's going to write it differently, and he's going to see what I did and go, And so it was hard. It's hard to get those things to mesh. And my frustration during that period was, I'm writing whatever it was I was writing at the time, chapter 2 or chapter 3 each month. And sometimes, I've told the story before, I would screw up the next guy, because I also like to be spontaneous when I work. So I'd be working out the plot, and suddenly some character would say or do something unexpected and change the arc of the plot, not knowing that, say, Tom DeFalco now has already turned in his plot, and now I've changed the end of the plot before, and he's got to go back and change that. It's a tough balance, and that's where the editors really have a tough job trying to coordinate all this stuff and keep everybody in their lane, and yet keep them coordinated at the same time. And the individual voice, can get lost when you're trying to tell this bigger interconnected story. But I always tried, whatever the story, you try to make it as meaningful and as important to you as you possibly can.
What are your favorite moments in things like that? And not in working on it, but in some of the stories that you've worked on. If you go back and read it,
Yeah.
For example. So for example, in Amazing Spider-Man 400,
Okay.
there's a page in there where Peter's watching old movies of himself. And Mary Jane comes in. She's like, "Oh, is this about that Ben Reilly thing?" And he's like, "You don't understand. Everything I am, he is too." And it's this really little moment in the story that is like so much bigger, and it changes everything, and it really does. And that's the stuff that appeals to me as a reader. And I'm curious, as a writer, what appeals to you the most? Is it that stuff, or is it like
Well,
the big
that's the
life
stuff. Yeah,
changing?
that's the stuff that makes the characters real,
Hmm.
right? You want. I talk about all basically all writing being autobiographical. Well, I've written. I did Brooklyn Dreams. It was an autobiographical graphic novel. Basically unfiltered. I changed the names to protect the innocent, but it was just my story. But I have as much autobiographical stuff in some ways in Spider-Man. If you really knew me well,
Hmm.
I have I'm going to plug something. I have a novella coming out June 21st, which you can buy as an ebook on Amazon, called The Excavator, and it's a supernatural thriller. It's about psychics, and yet I know, even though I'm not a psychic who's or I'm not in the FBI or any of these things that are in this story. I after I was done with it, I looked it over and I went, "Oh my God, this is all about my own psyche." You know what I mean? It's so, and then you want to bring in those moments of just gentle reality, normal. We all sit around. We've all looked at videos of ourselves or pictures of ourselves when we were kids, and these little things, the human moments, are what add the reality. So that when you jump into the larger than life moments,
Hmm.
you're there with a real person. You're not there with just Spider-Man, the superhero. You're there with Peter Parker, and of course, with Spider-Man, it's always Peter Parker. Probably, if you talk to any writer, no one writes Spider-Man. Everybody with mask on, mask off, we're all writing Peter Parker. That's what it is. Same thing with Ben. Same thing with Ben. And you talk about what we said before about these characters become a part of you. They become an aspect of you, and yet they become individuals, and then they become like friends. I mean, I know Peter Parker so well. I know Ben so well. I know them better than I know some of my own friends, because I know their hidden thoughts and
Hmm.
demons. I know everything about them. It's an interesting process. It's a relationship we have with, quote, fictional characters on the page.
One of the things about Ben Reilly I thought was really interesting, and I didn't catch it at the time, but something in the back of my head caught it. And it's like I have the bound copies that I had made for myself, and I pull them out once every couple of years and I read them. And there's this thing in the Lost Years where he tells Janine, who he is, and he's really worried that she's going to see him as a monster, and she doesn't. She sees him as a person. And when I read it the last time, I thought, well, this is why everybody loves this character, because he's the ultimate outsider. He's not, and I've heard you talk about in interviews about how he's darker, but I don't see it like that. I see it more along the lines of he's this character who is the ultimate outsider. And when you're a teenager, that's one of the reasons why people gravitate towards the X-Men, is because
Mm-hmm.
they're outsiders. And it's like, oh, well, I'm an outsider like Wolverine, blah, blah, blah. And I think that was the thing with Ben that appealed to everybody, was he was the outsider who was able to go and accomplish even more than
Right.
the person who was on.
Right. Well, yeah, I think that's a very good point, because he had his life, or his imagined life, torn away from him. I mean, he was literally an outsider when Aunt May died, right?
Mhm.
Peter's in the room, he's on the roof.
I know.
I mean, it's a literal outsider, and that's true. And then he spent 5 years on the road, and he had these experiences that made him. That's what I love about him. He's very different from Peter, and yet he is Peter at the same time. And
Right.
that's why in some ways, as much as I love Peter, Ben's a little more interesting in some ways than Peter is. And yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, I think the outsider quality, because he spent 5 years traveling the world trying to fit in, and never really could, and moving from place to place to place. And Janine was, really the one
Mhm.
grounding point that he found in his travels and in his life.
Something for you to think about when you work on part 2 of Ben Reilly Spider-Man. That'll be coming up soon. So you have, I don't want to keep you on too long, and I do have other questions, but
I could give you another 15 minutes or so for sure.
Okay, well, I want to make sure that you talk about things that you want to talk about, as opposed to having to answer my inane questions.
Well, first of all, they're not inane, so don't worry about
I know, I'm kidding. It was I don't really believe that. If
Okay,
I
good.
thought that, I would have never reached out to you. So
What would you have done if I would have said, yeah, those questions are so inane?
well, you know, it wouldn't have been any worse than I would have expected, right? You always aim for the bottom, then when you come up on top, it's all better.
Yeah, no, these are great questions.
Oh, thanks. So I'm going to ask about some specific stories,
Okay.
and I'm going to ask about one specific Spider-Man story, and then I'm going to ask you about something else that I think you're going to enjoy. So going back to that Amazing Spider-Man 400, where Aunt May tells Peter that she knows who he is, which was the fantastic moment. And then later on, when she was resurrected and they had her find out who he was for like 2 or 3 years, and then they took that away from her again. There's some really interesting stories there. And I'm wondering, have you ever considered how you would personally approach that of Aunt May knowing who he was?
I mean, if
stories moving forward from there.
Oh, if she had not died.
Yeah.
No, honestly, I've never thought about that. I just, that was the story that I told. And the truth was, it worked that way in reverse, because she had known for years.
Right.
What I established was that she knew. There was a certain point where she knew, and as we often do with ourselves, she couldn't allow herself to know, because to truly allow herself to know would be to be in a constant state of terror and worry for him, as he goes out and does these things, day after day, and risks his life. But she knew, and she was finally able to in those last moments. And I look back, and in my mind, that was real. It wasn't a fake thing. Aunt May died then. You have to in comics, everybody comes back, but if you're writing a death in comics, you as the writer have to believe this is it. This is the end. This is an actual death. And she was free to tell him, and to tell him how proud she was of him, and so, no, thinking going forward, no, but I can think about what she must have gone through in the past while knowing and trying to hold that secret, not just from Peter, but in a way from herself as well, and that's an interesting psychological battle. There's stories. I did a little backup story in one of the anniversary issues. I think Bob McLeod might have drawn it. I can't swear to it, but it was about Aunt May, and she's remembering the night that Uncle Ben.
Right?
Yeah, she's remembering Uncle Ben's death.
Right.
And
Stan Lee came in and scripted.
No, that's a different story. That was a different story. That story was about literally like the next day or something. Yeah, or that night. This was about May. Just one night she can't sleep, and she's remembering the night that Uncle Ben died, and we're understanding, why she feels so ambivalent about Spider-Man. And it's not because she thinks he's a terrible person, but she identifies him with that trauma, because Uncle Ben was killed, and yes, he was the guy that went and found the burglar and stopped him, but he's also forever woven in her mind with the pain and the trauma of that night, and think about that in terms of Aunt May's psyche. So then she understands that her nephew is Spider-Man. There's all this pain and trauma involved. So she had a lot of things to sort through for those years before she could come to that moment and tell him what she knew and tell him how proud she was of him.
When you're writing a death scene like that, obviously you're dealing with the people around the characters, and and this is a real side comment, the Aunt May death scene where Aunt Anna and Mary Jane come in the background, and you just see the looks on their faces. That's just real. I have to stop there, but that was really, really very interesting. You're obviously dealing with what a character like Peter is going through. Are you thinking about what Aunt May is thinking as well? Is she?
Yeah, I think you have to think about everybody. It's everybody's point of view. The minute you write, a word of dialogue comes out of that character, you're in their head. So maybe the focus is on Peter, but I'm thinking no, and that the focus is also Aunt May and how she. Now I don't remember the story well enough. Was she interacting with him? Was she talking to him?
Yeah.
Just him talking. Okay.
Yeah, they were talking.
Yeah. So I'm in Aunt May's head as well, right? Because that's the same. the same issue where they're on the Empire State Building.
Yeah.
So yes, I was very much just as invested in Aunt May as I was in Peter. You have to be to make it authentic and make it real.
So here's more of a fun question for you, as opposed to like, hey, what do you think about death? You're a big Jack Benny fan, and
I am.
And we've actually gone back and forth on Twitter about it, and I sent something to you at one of the conventions. What's your favorite Jack Benny story?
My favorite story in terms of him and his life, or in terms of just the show?
The show. What's your favorite? What was your favorite thing in the show?
There's so many great, people now. There's going to be thousands of people. I don't know if thousands of people are watching, but if there were, thousands of people would be going, "Who's Jack Benny?" Right. Jack Benny was one of the greatest comedians ever, and in the golden age of radio, had the #1 comedy show, which in many ways was kind of Seinfeld before Seinfeld in a lot of ways. It was just a brilliant, to me, still my favorite comedy of all time. You could line up any other comedy show you want on television, and the best of the Benny shows are so much better. I don't know if this was my favorite, but this is what got me in the door. This was it must have been in the latter part of the 80s. And my local NPR station, for a period of time, every night at 8 o'clock, would play an old radio show. And all I know, growing up, I used to see Jack Benny on TV, and he was this amiable old man who people seemed to like, and he was okay. I didn't have any special affinity for him. I didn't feel negatively toward him. And I turned on the radio, and the show was one of these shows where they used to do shows set on the train. Like, they had been in New York, they're going back to Hollywood. I think they were coming back from Denver for some benefit performance in Denver, and they're going back to Hollywood. And I just was, laying on the couch with my eyes closed, listening to this thing, and I was hooked. You talk about the chemical that drops in your brain for comics. My old radio chemical dropped in my head, and it was like, these things are extraordinary because the stories can't exist without the audience. It's all audio, and you're closing your eyes and you're seeing a movie while they're creating this with sound effects and with the dialogue and everything else. And you're seeing the reactions, you're seeing where they are. And I just fell in love with Benny and that show from that moment on. There's a lot of other great old radio that I like. I love Orson Welles. I love the old Burns and Allen shows. I love the science fiction shows like Dimension X and X-1. But the Benny stuff, I still, to this day, whenever I'm in the car driving around, that's what I'm listening to, is a Jack Benny show. I was just doing it today. I had to go pick up some groceries, listening to some shows from 1940, and there's a golden age in there from about from after the war, right, and into about maybe 1952, 53, where they just, everything came together. And there's a lot of great shows before and great shows after, but there's a 7 or 8 year period in there where the shows are just perfection. It's just, and it's funny and it's smart. And yes, some of the things are dated, and you take a deep breath and you breathe through things that people couldn't get away with today, But overall, I mean, the humor is still so sharp, and so we can connect to it, and the characters are so rich. It's just great stuff. I just love it. I love it. Radio, well, podcasts now are bringing back radio, essentially. People are like, "Oh, podcasts, is this some new thing?" No, it's radio. Come again. That's all it is. And we're seeing, all these radio dramas coming back, and they just released this big Batman thing on Spotify that David Goyer wrote. It's radio. It's old radio back again. That's what it is. And there's a magic to that can't be touched. One of my favorite things to get away from Benny is I love Orson Welles too. And the first thing he ever did on radio, even before the Mercury Theater on the Air, was an adaptation of Les Miserables, a multi-part. And it's brilliant. It's amazing. It's just so good. And again, you close your eyes, and it's not like watching TV or watching a movie. You have to create the movie. And in a way, it's similar to comics in that when we read a comic, we're seeing a bunch of static panels, and the artist is drawing it in such a way that there's movement. But in order for it to really move, you need the participation of the reader's imagination to connect those panels together, to create the movement, to create the voices for the characters. Your voice for Peter Parker is not my voice for Peter Parker. All the characters, as we read them, it's different. The panels move differently for you than they do for me. So I like those things that will just engage our imaginations, and the audience. The art form does not exist without the audience, and that's true for comics, and it's true for radio.
There was there was a point during Jack Benny where he was off for a couple weeks, and Orson Welles did
Yes,
the show.
fantastic shows.
I
Oh
know.
my God. And Welles, tried after that. He did a show called Orson Welles Almanac, I think.
Mhm.
We had a lot of comedy because he had such a good time doing that, and it never came together. He needed the Benny writers to write the show
Right.
for him, is what he needed, because he was great on that. He was, you don't think of Orson Welles as a comic actor, but he was so good on it because he hosted it for like 3 or 4 weeks.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, because Benny had the flu or something and he couldn't
Right.
be on. Yeah, that was great, just great stuff. So for me, as a Wells fan and a Benny fan, it doesn't get
Oh,
much
sure.
better than that. Or the shows that got set up because I think he had guested on the show before that, and he was
Mhm.
always sending up his image of the boy genius.
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah, and it was
And that
great.
stuff too, where he walks in and just starts changing everything.
Right, right. Or three people have to come in to announce him before Wells even walks into the room. It's just great stuff. And the great thing is, both my kids were raised on radio in that sense that
Uh-huh.
I turned them on to all these old radio shows. So both my son and my daughter, you go find them in their room, and what they're doing, they're listening to Jack Benny on these, back in those days on these cassette tapes. And then my son from that, got into all the BBC Lord of the Rings and Hitchhiker's Guide and all that stuff. But it started with his love of Jack Benny. My daughter, I think in probably in grade school, high school, and in college, wrote papers about the Benny Show. And
Mhm.
when she was in Vassar, she was taking a class on race in America. She wrote a paper, a deep dive about Rochester and his representation through the years, from the beginning when he was a
Mhm.
cliche to the end when he was really Benny's equal. And you see the progression of our perception of Black people in America through the portrayal of Rochester. And she got a great grade on it too.
That's really interesting. I had one of the reasons why I asked about your favorite story was it was a few years ago where things weren't going all that great. And here in Chicago, we have a radio show which you can pick up anytime called "Those Were the Days," and they do
Mhm.
Jack Benny month every February. And Chuck Shaden, who actually saved all of that stuff that you're listening to, or who collected it and was able to get it out there, that all came from his collection. He did one of the Jack Benny months where he did the "I Hate Jack Benny Because" stuff
Right.
that started with Jack Benny being robbed. And Mel Blanc was the robber, and then he found out where he lived and like robbed his house too. But this thing went on for like weeks and weeks, and I listened to it all in one day, and it reminded me a lot of the Justice League stuff you guys did.
I could see that because, I think about it, I was probably discovering the Benny Show really right around the time when I was writing Justice League. And
Mhm.
as the years go by, I could probably go through those books and find little rhythms to the jokes and things that come directly from my absorbing the writing on the Benny Show and the interactions of the characters there. I've always wanted to do a story. I have something in mind. I don't want to say what genre it is, but I want to base the characters on the various Benny characters and then
Uh-huh.
build them out from there. But do a big adventure comic. But this character would be kind of the Jack character with the toupee, and maybe he's wearing, that whole thing. The insecurity underneath the heroism. Yeah, absolutely, that influenced the way I wrote Justice League. Absolutely.
Yeah, and that particular story I'm talking about, there was one point where a marching band came out. It was just the funniest thing I had ever heard in my life.
And
And
that's what you're saying. They would develop these things from
yeah.
week to week. So a joke would get a huge laugh that if you were just listening to that show, you would have no idea why it's funny. You needed to listen to the 4 weeks before that for
Mhm.
the joke to pay
Right,
off.
right. So I want to make sure that you can go and have the rest of your day
Yeah.
since it's
So
Saturday.
let's give it like 10 minutes and we'll wrap up. How's that?
Okay, that sounds good. Well, if that's the case, then well, now we're not going to end on something light. Thanks a lot. So we'll go back to characterizations real quick, if you
Okay.
don't mind. I'd asked you if you had read some of these characters before. Did you ever talk to anybody? Did you, like, before you start, for example, before you started writing Peter Parker, did you talk to Stan Lee about him or about his characters or any?
No. Yeah.
I
Hi,
saw the look
Stan.
on
You
your
don't know
face.
who I am, but would you tell me about Peter Parker? No, because I'd read Spider-Man my whole life.
Mhm.
Um, No, I don't think I don't usually discuss the characters with the previous writers. It's more about reading the material than it is about talking to other people. Yeah, yeah.
Has anyone come to you?
I'm trying to think. If they have, it's not very often. No,
Okay.
no. I think because it's about the stories. It's you know what I mean. And anything you want to know from me is going to be in my stories. You don't have to call me up and say, what did you mean by this? It's right there. It's in the story. That's my vision of Spider-Man. So you don't really need to ask me about it as a writer who's going to continue, because you're a writer. You get your insights, you glean what you can, then you bring your own vision to it and you move on.
The reason I asked that was Chris Yost had done a Kane series about a decade ago. And Kane had basically been restored. And so he was off basically doing the Ben Reilly thing, trying to create a life for himself. And a lot of the stuff that was in your books was in there. It was a very good series. Very, very, very good. And he's having nightmares the way Ben had him on the bus and stuff. So I was curious as to, that's an example of, did anyone reach out to you and say, hey, what did you?
Yeah, like I said, they don't have to, because all they have to do is read the story. It's just like you could see the echoes of other writers in my work because I know them through their work. One of my favorite writers, comic book writers before me, was Steve Gerber. I adored his work. And you can see the imprint of his work in my work as I was finding my own voice. I met him once, but I didn't do a deep dive into what were you thinking or anything like that, because it was all there in his work. It's always interesting when you see stuff that's influenced by what you did. I can see where I'm influenced by other people, but I've seen some Spider-Man stories where it's like, oh, they're really doing that thing that I did, And what you hope for yourself, and sometimes you succeed and sometimes you don't. What you hope for the person who's doing with you is that, yes, you build on that foundation, but you bring something original to the table. And I can see stories from my early days where you can see my influences, not just in comics, but in literature and every place else. And I didn't bring enough uniqueness, and it just felt like I was just regurgitating other things. And other times you can see, as you find your voice, the more distinctive your voice becomes, it doesn't matter. Like Moonshadow, every influence I ever had was in Moonshadow, but it was my voice leading the way, and it became its own unique thing. It wasn't just me regurgitating Ray Bradbury or Kurt Vonnegut or whoever it was that was on my mind when I was writing.
So tell me about your influences.
My influences, God, there's so many. In comics,
away from comics.
My favorite writers. Okay. Dostoevsky, Ray Bradbury, Charles Dickens, J.D. Salinger, God, so many more. And of course, now I'm drawing a blank. Philip K. Dick. I love Philip K. Dick. Just those 5 guys at the times I've spent reading and rereading their work, and so many others. I'd have to go down to my proper library downstairs and just walk around and go, oh yeah, of course, how could I forget Isaac Bashevis Singer or
right.
John Irving or whoever it may be, sometimes there are writers that you fall in love with for a certain period of time. You read a ton of their stuff and then you may not go back to them years later, but they've left their imprint on you, and other ones like the guys I've mentioned are the writers that I return to again and again and again. I'll be reading Bradbury forever. I'll be reading Dickens forever. Just maybe it was the last year or the first year of the pandemic, I reread David Copperfield for like the 3rd time. And each time, it brings something else forward that wasn't there before, which you hope great literature always does.
I heard something real recently about that. And what the person said was, when you read something a second time, it's not that there's something that's changed in there, it's something that's changed in you.
Right. And there's a lot of truth in that. Sure. If I'm reading David Copperfield when I was the first time 15 or 16, then I read it again in my 20s, then I read it again in my 40s, and on and on and on, you're a different person. So you bring a different perception. But there is also, when you were reading it at 15, there were things that were in that story that you couldn't see, themes that you couldn't catch, things spoke to you differently. So each time you will find something different. Part of it is because you have changed, and part of it is just because you're now able to see the things in that story that you didn't see before. And, I see with my own work. People will find things that I don't think I put there. And then they say, but what about that? And you go, yeah, that's really interesting. Maybe that your interpretation may be just as valid as mine,
Mhm.
and I may find things in a Dickens novel or a Philip K. Dick novel or whatever it may be, that the author didn't intend, but it means something to me nonetheless. And you can pull that out. Now if someone's going to interpret something in some really horrible way, obviously I got to step up and say, no, you are really, really wrong. But there's room there in the middle for interpretation. People sometimes on Twitter are asking questions of, what did this mean? And did this mean exactly like that? And does this fit? And I'm like,
Mhm.
I don't know. So first of all, on one level, I don't know. I wrote the story. I always say, once you release the story into the wild, it
Right.
belongs as much to the audience as it does to you. So within reason, your interpretation of that story is as valid as mine. Now, if you're using that interpretation for something ugly, then we draw the line there. But most people are not doing that, So there are things in my stories that I'm not even aware of, and then someone will point it out, or someone will point out, oh, that theme, and suddenly I never saw that theme before. But you're right. I never understood. Sometimes someone will ask me a question, and I'll look back at the story and go, yeah, that's true. My conscious mind didn't know it, because the unconscious mind is doing the heavy lifting.
Mhm.
The conscious mind is the editor. He's the one who's making sure it's all cleaned up and that the sentence structure is getting corrected there. But the essence of the story is flowing out of your unconscious. So it's like a Rorschach test. Throw it at the wall, see what, you know what I mean? And see what the pattern is. And we'll all find different things in that pattern. And sometimes you'll find something in the pattern of my story that I didn't see, and you'll be right.
You
It's
know,
interesting.
it is very interesting, and it's interesting the way you're talking about this. And I was going to ask you a question about the poetic nature of your writing. And there is a poetic nature to it that I have not seen in anyone else's work. And you started doing that thing where, and you've talked about this quite a bit in interviews, where you weren't using thought balloons, you're using the captions.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that was around the same time that Frank Miller started doing that in The Dark Knight, and it just kind of
Right.
like became something. But the thing with something like The Dark Knight is it's not poetic in the sense that your stuff is poetic. There's something else to it. And I before we got on, I was thinking about some of the quotes, some quotes that I could have pulled from your stuff. And I actually considered doing a reading, but I decided that probably wasn't a good idea. How often do you go back and read your own stuff? Or do you ever?
Occasionally,
Uh-huh.
sometimes, like I'm working on Ben Reilly, and then I'll go back and pull out some of the old stories. And it's been long enough that I go like, wow, that was pretty
Mhm.
good. Or oh, that was not so good. But someone on Twitter the other day said, doing a reading, I guess they're like a voiceover actor, and they took like a few pages from one of the Clone Saga stories that I
Uh-huh.
wrote, a dialogue between Ben and Peter, and they did a whole voiceover thing.
Hmm.
And I hadn't seen that story in years. If you would have told me someone else wrote it, I would have gone, oh yeah, okay, because I didn't remember writing it. But obviously, it was my story, and it was like, you go, well, that was good. I'm always impressed when it's good and it still holds up, and I'm not that surprised if it doesn't hold up, because you keep growing as a writer, and you hopefully you can look back and go, oh, well, I've grown since then. I'm better than that. And sometimes I read things and I go, I don't know if I could write something that good now.
Mhm.
I don't know where did it come from. It's all, the great thing about what we do as creative people, is there's a level where it's always a mystery, and it will always be
Mhm.
a
Mhm.
mystery. And I embrace that mystery, and I love the mystery of it, the mystery of creation, the mystery of where do these things really come from. I love that. So, and in terms of the poetry of it, I think it's maybe just my nature. I have a poetic nature. I'm also a musician and a songwriter. So,
Mhm.
song lyrics, very poetic. And as many teenagers did, I wrote poetry when I was a teenager, probably really awful poetry, I'm sure. But I think, yeah, there's a flow. And also, I think there's a flow to comics and the way comics are written, in our little boxes, in these captions that move across the page with a certain rhythm, and the way one caption will flow into the next and wait for the art to breathe and come back with the caption. It's poetry. It is poetic. The way you bring a sentence to a certain point on this page, and then boom on the next page to bring you over with that. That's poetry. It's song lyrics. It's music. There's rhythm, there's melody, there's a bass line going here, and there's a melody line going here, and there's a rhythm going here, so it is poetic. I think comics are poetic by nature. Again, if you choose to. The great thing about comics is they can be anything. I always say that people that say comics are just like movies on paper, that's true, if that's what you want them to be. For me, sometimes comics are a fusion of prose and pictures. I get very, as you must know, can get very prose heavy, and I like to do that. And there's no reason why you can't do that. What do you mean you can't put all those words on a page? It's a comic book. Yes, I can if I decide that's what I want to do, and everything in between, whatever you want to make that comic. And I love when I see people that are still playing with the form and inventing with the visual storytelling or the verbal storytelling. And I go, wow, I would have never thought to do it that way. That's really cool. There's always new ways to tell a story. Comics aren't one thing or another. There are a million things. And that's what's beautiful about them.
So and so now we really will wind up.
Right. I want to do my plugs before we go.
Yes, and that's what I was about to ask. So you're actually you have something online where you actually look at people's work.
Yes.
And help them out.
There's two things. I do these writers workshops called Imagination 101, which I've been doing. I do them with regular irregularity. I do them when when I feel the urge, And then the pandemic came. I did a couple online, and then I haven't had a chance to do it. But I also do this other thing called Creation Point Story Consultation, which you can find on my website, jamdematteis.com, where I work with people one-on-one, and I love doing that. People come to me with their comic book scripts or their short stories or their novels or their screenplays. I read them, we get on Skype, we discuss them, they go back, they rewrite, they bring it back, we talk about it. And my job is not to impose my vision on your story. My job is to help you find the heart and soul of your vision and tell that story in the best way possible to serve your vision. And I really love it. I love working with people one-on-one that way. And I've worked with some great, great people, So if you go to my website and look that up, there's an email there. And if you want to work with me, send me an email and I'll be happy to do that. So thanks for bringing that up, because sometimes I forget about that. And it's one of my favorite things that I do. And I mentioned I have this novella coming very shortly called The Excavator. You can go to Amazon.com and pre-order that. It's an ebook, it's a novella, so it's very cheap. It's not a big investment, but I'm very, very proud of this story. I'm really happy with it. Ben Reilly's wrapping up next month, and then there'll be a collected edition, I think in July. The collected edition of Justice League Infinity, which was basically our sequel series to the Justice League Unlimited TV series that James Tucker and I wrote together. That's coming out in July, the collected edition of that. I had a great time working on that, because Justice League Unlimited was one of my favorite animation gigs. It was really the gig that opened the door to my whole career in animation. So to get together with James, who is a producer on the show, and co-write that series together with great art by Ethan Beavers and Nick Filardi, just a pleasure. So I'm really excited that's coming out. And I have a lot of other projects in the works. I have 5 different creator-owned projects that will be out before the end of this year. I have, and I can't talk about them yet, but some of them will be emerging in the fall via a Kickstarter.
Okay.
So, and maybe as it gets closer to that, because I'm going to have to go out and really ring the bell for this Kickstarter. So maybe I'll come back and we'll talk about that.
Do. That'd be great.
So if you see me kind of inching toward that, feel free to reach out, and I would love to come back and talk about that. And
have you done any crowdfunding in the past?
No, never. This is the first time, and I can't get into what it is, but it's a really exciting concept and premise, and I'm really thrilled about it, and I can't wait to get it out in the world. And there will be more with the mainstream publishers as well. But I can't, again, I'm working on something right now that I can't talk about. It's always a problem when it's like, yeah, I'm working on this, and this, and I can't tell you anything about it, but there's a lot of work coming before the year is out.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
And then, so around it, I don't need to say this right now, but I'll say it anyway. So around the end of the year, I'll reach out to you again, and we'll set something up.
Right. Well, the Kickstarter will probably be in September or October.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds great.
The end of the summer. Yeah, that'd be great. We'll figure something out.
So I'm gonna wrap this up. Stay here though for 1 second, and I'll say goodbye to you properly. So thank you very much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you everyone for watching. The links to all of J.M. Dematteis' stuff is in the description below, as well as a link to order a free digital copy of my book Visitations. And